the basketball hit the floor. Then Malik did. No warning, no stumble, no slow-motion fall that gave anyone time to react. 1 second he was cutting left toward the basket, sneakers squealing against the gym floor, sweat flying off his jersey, and the next second he was down, hard, like something inside him just quit. The crowd went quiet first. Then a girl screamed. Then everyone moved at once. "Malik, somebody call an ambulance. He's not breathing right. Give him space. Give him space." Sanaa Whitmore was already running before the last echo left the bleachers. She had been sitting 3 rows up, still in her hospital scrubs, still exhausted from a 12-hour shift she had not fully recovered from, eating a bag of pretzels, and watching her son do the thing he loved most in the world. Now she was on her knees beside him on the hardwood, 2 fingers pressed to the side of his throat, her nurse's brain taking over before her mother's heart could collapse completely. His pulse was there. Weak, off rhythm, but there. "Malik." Her voice was steady. That was the training. Keep your voice steady no matter what burns behind your eyes. "Malik, baby, I need you to open your eyes." His lashes fluttered. His lips moved, but nothing came out except a thin, terrible sound. Something between a cough and a gasp, and then a thread of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth, dark and thin, catching the gymnasium lights like something it had no business doing. Sanaa's entire body went cold. She had seen blood in every form a hospital could produce. She had held pressure on wounds. She had watched people die with their families in the hallway. She had done all of that without flinching because that was the job. But this was her son. This was Malik, 14 years old, size 12 sneakers, the boy who burned toast every single morning and still insisted he could cook. The boy who argued with her about everything and apologized about nothing and somehow still managed to kiss her cheek every night before bed like he was 7 years old again. And there was blood on his lip, and his eyes would not stay open. "Stay with me." She gripped his hand. "You stay with me right now." The ambulance took 11 minutes. Those 11 minutes lasted longer than any year she could remember. Welcome. If this is your first time here, this channel is where real stories live, the ones about survival, about betrayal, about the people the world forgets until the truth refuses to stay buried. Hit that follow button and stay close, because this story is only getting started. The emergency room at Northwestern Memorial moved the way emergency rooms always do, fast and cold and without sentiment. Doctors spoke in abbreviations. Machines beeped in languages only they understood. Curtains got pulled. Curtains got opened. Nobody stood still long enough to look anyone in the eye. Sanaa stood at the edge of that chaos and understood every single word being said about her son, and that understanding made it worse. She was not a frightened mother guessing at what the numbers meant. She was a nurse who knew exactly what those numbers meant, and the numbers were bad. The attending physician, a young black man with dark circles under his eyes that told Sanaa he had been on since yesterday, pulled her aside with the careful, practiced gentleness that doctors learn when the news requires softening before it lands. "Miss Whitmore." He kept his voice low. "We're looking at a potential hereditary blood disorder, the kind that doesn't announce itself, it waits. Then one physical trigger, one moment of extreme exertion, and the blood stops clotting the way it should." Sanaa already knew what was coming next. She had known it was coming the moment she saw that thread of blood at her son's lip. She had been refusing to know it for the last 40 minutes. "I need to ask you about the father's medical history." The doctor held his clipboard like he was trying to give his hands something to do. "This type of condition has a very specific hereditary pattern. If we can trace it genetically, we can build a treatment protocol that actually targets the right." "He's not in the picture." "I understand. But even a name, a family origin, he's not in the picture." She said it again, same words, harder this time. Not because she was angry at the doctor, because saying it twice made it feel more like armor and less like the wound it actually was. The doctor paused, then quietly, carefully, like someone stepping around broken glass. "Miss Whitmore, without that genetic history, we are essentially treating your son blind. We can stabilize him tonight. But if this is what I think it is, and I have seen this presentation before without knowing the paternal line, Your son could be back in this room within the month, except next time. He stopped. She finished the sentence herself, in the silence of her own mind. Next time might not have an ambulance. She walked to the hallway. She stood against the wall. She pressed her back flat against the cold plaster and closed her eyes and breathed the way she had taught herself to breathe in the years after everything slow in, slow out, count to 4, don't let the walls close in. 5 years. 5 years she had carried this alone. 5 years since she had heard his voice, seen his name on her phone, felt the particular, specific weight of loving someone who chose or was forced to disappear. She did not know which one it was. That was the part that had eaten her alive in the small hours of every night she could not sleep. She did not know if he left, or if he was taken. She reached into the pocket of her scrubs. Her phone was warm from being against her body all evening. The contact had no name, just a number she had memorized 5 years ago and never been able to make herself delete. The way you cannot make yourself throw away a thing that once meant everything, even when keeping it only hurts you. She stared at it. From inside the room behind her, one of the machines changed its tone. A nurse called out. Sanaa heard the word crashing, and her feet were already moving before her mind gave permission back through the curtain, back to Malik's side, back to pressing his hand and watching his face go the color of old ash under the fluorescent lights. He needs that history, the doctor said again, directly. No softness left now, because softness was a luxury, and time was not. Miss Whitmore, whatever happened, whatever the situation is right now, the only thing that matters is that boy. She looked at her son's face. She saw Kyren's eyes looking back at her. She always did. Every single day for 5 years, she had looked at her sons and seen the man who vanished in the way Malik held his jaw when he was angry, in the way Asher went quiet when something hurt him. In the shape of 2 pairs of eyes that belonged to a ghost, she could not stop loving no matter how hard she tried. She walked back to the hallway. She found the contact. Her thumb hovered. And somewhere in Seoul, South Korea, in a glass-walled penthouse so high above the city that the streets below looked like a map of someone else's life, a man who had not slept a full night in 5 years sat at his desk in the dark, pressing his knuckles against his temple, trying to stop the headache that came without warning and left behind images he could not name. Baby shoes. A woman's laugh. Rain against a window. Fire. His phone lit up on the desk. An international number. Chicago. He stared at it for 3 full seconds, long enough that most calls would have given up, and then something in his hand moved before his mind decided anything. And he answered, yes. 1 word. 1 voice. And Sanaa Whitmore's entire body stopped functioning for a moment that had no measurable length. She knew that voice. She had spent 5 years trying to unknow it. Now it was in her ear, and her son was crashing behind a curtain, and the doctor was waiting, and the number on the screen had no name because she had never been able to give it one. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Hello? He said again, and something in the way he said it, careful, slightly rough, carrying the particular texture of a man who did not sleep, cracked the silence open. She pressed her hand flat against the wall to keep herself standing. And on the other side of the world, Kyren Tae-Min Valez felt the headache split through his skull like a blade and saw, for exactly 1 second, a hospital room, a woman's face, and 2 heartbeats on a screen. Then, it was gone. And his hands were shaking, and he did not know why. Before this story goes any further, drop 1 word in the comments right now. Just 1. Would Sanaa have made that call if Malik wasn't dying? Just 1 word, yes or no. Because that answer says everything about what kind of love this actually was. Chapter 2. The rain came down on Chicago like it had a grudge. Not soft rain. Not the kind that makes people nostalgic. The kind that drives sideways and turns headlights into blurs, and makes every street in the city look like the same street, dark, wet, going nowhere. Inside the underground clinic on the south edge of River North, 3 men were screaming at once. 2 of them had guns. One of them was bleeding through a shirt that cost more than most people's rent. That one was Kyren. He was sitting in the only chair in the room that wasn't covered in medical equipment, leaning slightly forward, one hand pressed against his left side, where the blade had gone in during what was supposed to be a negotiation. His face was completely still. Not calm still. There is a difference. Calm is something you feel. Still is something you build over years when showing pain becomes dangerous. The armed men were arguing about who to call. The doctor, a short man in his 60s who had been providing off-book medical care for the Chicago Syndicate for 11 years, was arguing back at both of them while simultaneously trying to apply pressure to a wound that was deeper than he had initially assessed. Nobody was talking to Kyren. That was normal. People did not talk to Kyren Tae-Min Valez when he was injured. They talked around him, about him, over him, as if acknowledging his vulnerability directly might trigger something nobody wanted to find out about. He let them argue. He kept his hand on his side, and his breathing measured, and his eyes on the door across the room habit, always know your exits. And he thought about the deal that had gone wrong, and the man who had moved too slowly, and the 3 seconds between the flash of the blade and the moment he had neutralized the situation. 3 seconds. That was the margin. His whole life existed in margins like that. Then she walked in. Not dramatically. Not with any announcement. She came through the side door in dark blue scrubs, a badge still clipped to her chest from a shift that had clearly not ended cleanly. Her natural hair pulled back. A medical bag over one shoulder, and a look on her face that said she had walked into chaotic rooms before and found them significantly less impressive than the people inside them believed. The armed men turned toward her. She looked at them the way you look at furniture you're deciding whether to move. Then she looked at the doctor. They called me in for overflow. Her accent landed soft South London pressed under years of American speech. The two layered over each other like something warm underneath something newer. What are we working with? Penetrating abdominal wound, the doctor said. Deep. We need a second. I can see that. She was already crossing the room, already pulling gloves from her bag, already reading the situation with the fast, quiet efficiency of someone who had triaged worse. She reached Kyren's side, crouched to his level, and looked directly at his face. He looked back. Nobody looked directly at Kyren Tae-Min Valez. Not like that. Not straight on. Without flinching. Without the small, involuntary step backward that most people took when they got close enough to understand what his eyes actually contained. She did not step back. She looked at him the way a person looks at another person. That was all. That was everything. I'm going to need to examine the wound, she said. I need you to move your hand. It'll bleed more. I know. That's why I'm here. She held his gaze. You can keep the hand there and keep bleeding slowly. Or you can move it and let me figure out how to stop it properly. Your call. A short pause. But make it fast. You don't have a lot of time to be stubborn. One of the armed men shifted. Kyren raised 2 fingers without looking away from her, and the man went still. Then, slowly, he moved his hand. She worked without narrating herself. The way good nurses do no reassuring commentary. No performed calmness. Just the real thing. Her hands were steady. Her focus was absolute. She asked the doctor 2 questions in quick succession, got the answers she needed, and made a decision about pressure and positioning that the doctor immediately recognized as correct. Kyren watched her work. He did not speak. He was trying to understand something he could not name, the specific quality of stillness she brought into the room. The way the temperature of the air seemed to change when she moved through it. Not warmer exactly, but less sharp. He had not felt less sharp in a very long time. This is going to hurt, she said, preparing the next step. Everything hurts. She looked up at him briefly. That's not an answer. It wasn't a question. Something crossed her face, not quite a smile. Not quite, not one either. She returned to what she was doing. You can threaten everybody else later, she said quietly, as though she was telling him something he already knew and just needed reminding of. Right now, stay alive. The room went a little quieter. Even the 2 armed men, who had been vibrating with adrenaline since the moment they carried their boss through the door, seemed to exhale slightly. Kyren said nothing. He stayed alive. That was the first night. There were more. Not because Kyren needed continued medical care beyond what the clinic could provide. His body healed fast, always had, a stubborn refusal to be broken that had served him well in his line of work. But he came back to the clinic 3 times in the following 2 weeks with reasons that grew progressively thinner. The third time, the doctor was not there. She was. "He's not here," she said, barely looking up from the chart she was reviewing. "I know." She looked up then. He was standing in the doorway in dark clothes, no guards visible, no weapons obvious, wearing the kind of expensive jacket that was designed to look like it wasn't expensive. He looked different without the crisis around him, less like a weapon. Still dangerous, that did not go away. It was too deep in the way he carried himself, but the particular edge of emergency was absent, and without it, he looked like something more complicated than what his reputation described. "What do you actually need?" she asked. He took a moment with the question. "I don't know," he said. It was the most honest thing he had said to anyone in years, and he knew it the moment it left his mouth. And the knowing of it made his jaw tighten because honesty was a habit he had broken a long time ago. She studied him for a moment longer than was strictly professional. "Sit down," she said finally. "You look like someone who hasn't slept in a while." "I haven't slept in a while. I can tell." She set the chart down and looked at him with that direct, unflinching regard that had unnerved him the first night and had not stopped unnerving him since. Why? No one asked him why. People asked him what. "What do you need? What should we do? What are your orders? What is the plan?" Why was a different kind of question. Why assume there was something underneath the surface worth knowing? He sat down, and for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, he answered. Those conversations started small. What kept him awake? What Chicago looked like from 40 floors up when the city could not see you watching it. She told him what London had looked like from a train window on the worst morning of her life, the day she left after her mother died, watching the skyline disappear behind her, thinking that grief was something you outran if you moved fast enough. She had learned otherwise. He learned what she meant. He came back without reasons after a while. Just came. Late evenings, no announcement, always after the clinic closed and she was doing her own reading or paperwork or sitting with a cup of tea she had almost finished going cold. He brought nothing. He said little. He sat in the chair across from hers, and they talked about everything except what he did for money, and everything except who she was supposed to be afraid of. She was not afraid of him. That was the thing he could not get past. Not because she was foolish or naive, she was neither. She understood exactly what he was, but because she seemed to have made a decision, at some point, before he understood what was happening, that fear was not the appropriate response to Kyren the person, only to Kyren the title. And nobody had separated those two things before. He laughed one evening, genuinely, unexpectedly, at something she said about a patient who had come into the emergency room insisting he had been poisoned by his neighbor's cooking, and the sound surprised him so completely that he stopped and looked at his own hands as if they belonged to someone else. She noticed. She said nothing. That was another thing about her. She understood which moments required words and which ones required silence. Most people, in his experience, could not tell the difference. He started sleeping. Not well. Not without the old imagery at the edges. Violence lives in the body long after the events are over, but more than before. Longer, less sharp. He did not tell anyone. There are things that only stay real if you protect them from other people's opinions. Then, one late October evening, she said his name. Just his name. No title, no formality, and her voice was different. Careful in a new way. "I need to tell you something." He waited. She told him. The world rearranged itself. He sat very still for a long time after she finished. Then he pressed both hands flat on the table between them and looked at them, his hands, the tools of everything he had built and broken, and when he looked up at her, she was watching him with the particular steadiness of someone who was prepared to hear any answer and had already decided they would survive it. "Twins," he said. "Yes." Something moved through him that he had no word for. Not happiness exactly, too large for that. Too seismic. Too much like the ground shifting under a building that thought it was permanent. "I'm done," he said. She blinked once. Done. With all of it. He said it the way people say things that scare them quickly, before the part of the brain that protects you can interrupt. I'm done. I want out. He stopped. Started again. I want to be here. For this. For you. For them. She looked at him for a long time. That's not a small thing to say, she told him. I know what it is. His voice was steady. I know what it costs. I'm saying it anyway. She reached across the table, placed her hand over his. She did not say yes. She did not say she believed him. She just held his hand in the quiet of the empty clinic with the city moving outside the window, and let that be enough for tonight. And somewhere in a building downtown, in a room full of expensive furniture and carefully managed silences, a woman received a phone call. Her name was Madame Kyren Valez. And the voice on the other end told her that Kyren had made a promise. She set down her tea. She did not speak for a long moment. Then, find out everything about the woman. What would you have done? Stayed silent about the pregnancy? Or told him the truth? Drop your answer below. Because the choice Sanaa made that night was about to cost everything. Chapter 3. Madame Kyren Valez did not raise her voice. She never had to. The people who worked for her had learned early that the quieter she became, the more dangerous the moment was. That volume was for people who needed to perform authority, and Kyren had never performed anything in her life. She simply acted. And then, the world rearranged itself around her actions. She was 61 years old, and looked, in the right light, like someone's composed and elegant grandmother. Silver hair kept immaculate. Hanbok on formal occasions. A specific and calculated brand of Italian fashion for business. Reading glasses on a thin gold chain. A way of folding her hands in her lap that looked like patience and functioned like a threat. She had built the Valez financial syndicate from a grief-hollowed organization after Kyren's father, her brother, died of a heart attack that she had always privately believed was stress she had helped engineer, though she had never said so aloud. She had taken the fractured pieces of a criminal empire and turned them into something that looked, from the outside, like a collection of legitimate investment firms, import operations, and private equity interests. What it looked like on the outside was her greatest creation. She had done all of this for Kyren. That was what she told herself. That was what she believed. Which made what he was doing now not just a mistake. It was a betrayal. The report arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by a man whose only visible job was delivering reports and whose actual usefulness was in the things he found that people had tried to make unfindable. Kyren read it twice. Then she set it on the desk in front of her and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of her Chicago office, at the lake below, gray and enormous and indifferent, the way Lake Michigan always was in October. Sanaa Whitmore, 31 years old, born in Hackney, East London, to a Nigerian-British mother who died of cancer 14 months ago. Emergency room nurse, Northwestern Memorial. No criminal history. No syndicate connections, no financial complications, no agenda that the investigator could identify. No agenda. That was the most damaging line in the entire document. Women with agendas were manageable. Women with agendas wanted money, or status, or access things that could be negotiated, redirected, priced out. Kyren had handled those women before. Several times, with efficiency and zero personal feeling. But a woman with no agenda was a woman who was simply there because she chose to be. And a woman who simply chose Kyren, not the power, not the money, not the mythology, was a woman who could change him in ways that had nothing to do with leverage. Kyren had watched it happening for weeks. The reports came back the same way every time. Less time in the office, shorter meetings, decisions made with a patience that had not been in his character before. A quality of distraction that his lieutenants attributed to stress, and that Kyren, who had known this boy since birth, recognized as something else entirely. Happiness. Kyren was becoming happy. And happy men made poor kings. She called him that afternoon. Come to dinner Saturday, she said. I want to talk about the Busan expansion. I'll send someone. I want you. A pause, thin and precise. It's family business, Kyren. He came. She watched him across the dinner table, watched how he sat slightly differently, ate with slightly less urgency. responded to business conversation with his full intelligence, but without the particular hungriness she was used to seeing underneath it, as if something in him had been fed from a direction that business could not reach. She asked, carefully, about his plans. He did not mention Sanaa. She did not ask. But she listened to every word he said and every word he did not say. And by the time the meal was finished, she had understood the shape of what she was dealing with and made the decision that she would not allow herself to examine too closely, because examined decisions have to be justified, and this one was better left clean. The surveillance intensified. Sanaa noticed nothing. She was not a person who looked over her shoulder. She had lived, up until now, a life that gave her no reason to. She went to work. She came home. She answered Kyren's calls during her breaks and met him in the evenings when their hours aligned, and spent her nights thinking about the new shape her life was taking on and whether it was possible to trust a thing this large when everything about it seemed unreasonably good. She had one concern she carried quietly. She had told Kyren about the pregnancy, but not yet about the full weight of what twins meant: 2 children, 2 lives. The particular enormity of raising 2 people at once, and she was still watching him to see if his resolve was going to hold or if the reality of it was going to reach him in stages, and each stage would erode something. It did not erode. If anything, the opposite. He came to her apartment one evening with a paper bag of groceries he had bought himself, not sent someone to buy, bought himself, which she recognized as a man testing what ordinary felt like, and cooked badly and confidently and accepted her gentle corrections without ego. And they ate at her small kitchen table in her small apartment in Lincoln Square, and it was the most normal thing either of them had done in years. He fell asleep on her couch at 10:30. She put a blanket over him and stood there for a moment looking at him, really looking, the way you can only look at someone when they cannot see you doing it, and what she saw was a man who was trying, not performing, trying. She went to bed and felt, for the first time since arriving in America after her mother died, that the morning might be worth waking up for. She did not know that across the city, a car was parked at the end of her block. She did not know about the photographs. She did not know that Haejin had already consulted with 2 members of the syndicate's inner circle about what happened to organizations when their leaders made emotional decisions. And she did not know about the meeting that happened 3 days later, in a private room in a hotel near O'Hare, where a man was handed an envelope, and the words spoken over it were short and specific, and left no room for interpretation. She never heard the name of the man in the meeting. She would never need to. What she needed to know came 22 days later, on a morning she was not at the clinic, not at the hospital, not anywhere near Lakeshore Drive. She was at home, feet up, drinking the ginger tea that helped with the nausea, listening to the radio, thinking about names. She had been thinking about names for weeks, the particular intimacy of naming 2 people who did not yet exist outside of a heartbeat, and a sonogram printout she kept on the refrigerator. Her phone rang. A number she didn't recognize. She answered it because nurses answer unknown numbers. A man's voice, flat and official. "Are you Sanaa Whitmore?" "Yes." "There's been an incident on Lakeshore Drive." A pause. Not long. Seconds. But in those seconds, her body understood before her mind did understood, in the way the body always knows, the things the brain refuses to process. And the ginger tea grew cold in her hand, and the radio kept playing something bright and entirely wrong for the moment, and the paper with the names on it slipped off the table and landed face down on the floor. "What kind of incident?" she said. The man told her. She did not make a sound. She set the phone down on the table with both hands. She sat very still for 1 full minute. Then she went to the bathroom and was sick. Then she came back out and sat in the chair and pressed both hands against her stomach, where 2 lives were still quietly going about the business of growing, entirely unaware that the world had just changed around them in a way that could not be changed back. The news called it an explosion. The news said no survivors. The news was wrong about that. But she did not know that yet. And for the next several weeks, neither did anyone who could have told her the truth. Did Haejin believe she was protecting the empire, or was she protecting her control of Kyren? Think about that before the next chapter, because the answer changes everything. Chapter 4. He woke up not knowing his name. That was the first thing. Not the ceiling above him, white, unfamiliar, smelling of antiseptic, and something floral that was trying to cover the antiseptic. Not the machines. Not the restraints on his wrists, soft ones. The kind used when doctors are afraid a patient will pull out their own IV without understanding what they're doing. Not any of that. The first thing was the name. He searched for it the way you search for a word you know exists, that you have used 1,000 times, that lives somewhere just past the reach of where your mind is currently able to go, and it was not there. Not gone exactly. More like the door to it was closed, and he could not find the handle. He stared at the ceiling. A woman appeared at the edge of his vision. Silver-haired, composed, seated in a chair beside the bed in the way of someone who had been there a long time and intended to remain. Her hands folded in her lap. Her face arranged into an expression he could not read, except that it was careful, which was its own kind of information, even without the context to understand it. "You're awake," she said. He said nothing. His voice felt like something he had not used in a long time. "You had an accident." Her voice was steady. Not unkind. A specific kind of calm that was less about feeling and more about control. "You've been here for 3 weeks. The doctors say you're going to recover fully, but it will take time. Your brain suffered significant trauma." He looked at his hands. Strong hands. Several scars he did not remember receiving, which meant nothing yet because he did not remember anything. "Where is here?" he said. His voice came out rougher than he expected. "Busan," she said. "South Korea. You were brought here for your care. The facilities are better, and it was important to keep your recovery private." He processed this. "Who are you?" Something moved through her expression, quick, carefully managed, gone. "I'm your aunt, Kyren. My name is Haejin. You've known me your whole life." Kyren. He turned the name over. It did not unlock the door, but it fit in a way that nothing else had yet, which was something. "I had an accident," he repeated. "A car explosion. On Lakeshore Drive. In Chicago." She paused. "You were there for business. It went wrong. Several people were hurt. You were the only survivor." He nodded slowly. She waited. "What else?" he asked. "What do you mean?" "There are things I don't remember. I can feel that there are things I don't remember. There's a space." He pressed a hand to his chest. Not pain. Something else. A shape of absence he could not fill with any image. "There's something I should remember that I don't." Hyejin held his gaze for a long moment. "You had a lot of business obligations," she said. "Associates. Financial commitments. All of that is being managed. You don't need to worry about any of it right now." "That's not what I meant." "I know." She reached over and poured water from the pitcher beside the bed and placed the glass in his hand with the efficiency of someone who had been doing small caretaking acts for weeks and found them unremarkable. "Your memory will come back in pieces," she said. "That's what the doctors say. Don't force it. Rest. Heal. Everything else can wait." She said it so quietly and so reasonably that the part of him reaching for the missing thing became uncertain of itself, wondering if perhaps it was reaching at random, if the absence was simply the shape of the injury and not the shape of something real. He drank the water. He slept. The weeks that followed were structured in the way that only Hyejin could structure things so seamlessly managed that structure itself became invisible. She was there every morning when he woke, not hovering, simply present, in the chair, reading or handling correspondence, available when he surfaced and unobtrusive when he needed quiet. She answered his questions about the syndicate without volunteering more than he asked. She brought in physical therapists and a neurologist whose manner was gentle and whose assessments were thorough, and who, Kyren only recognized much later, reported exclusively to her. She fed him information slowly. The business, the holdings, the people who reported to him, names that produced faint recognition without any emotional content, like reading the cast of a film you'd heard of but never seen. She never mentioned Chicago without him asking first. When he did ask, she answered with facts, dates, locations, a brief outline of what the business relationship had been, nothing attached to emotion. Nothing that suggested the city was anything more than a place he had operated in for practical reasons. She never mentioned a woman. He did not know to ask, but the absence stayed. It lived in him at the edges of everything, at the boundary between sleep and waking. During the physiotherapy sessions, when his mind was occupied enough that his guard came down, in the long afternoons when Busan went quiet and the light came through the window at an angle that made the room feel temporary in a way he could not explain, he would find himself sitting very still, with no thought in his head, and a feeling in his chest that was not grief, exactly because grief requires a specific object, and he had no object. Only the space. Only the closed door. He drew things sometimes. During the quiet afternoons, not deliberately, his hand would find a pen and move while his attention was elsewhere. The results were always similar. Small things. Shoes. A window with rain on it. A shape that might have been a face if his hand knew how to finish it, which it never quite did. He would look at what he had drawn and feel the headache begin. He threw the drawings away. Meanwhile, she fed him the other things. Carefully. Gradually. Always in response to something he said, never initiated. Always reactive, so that they arrived as answers to his own questions rather than as information she was installing. The first time, he asked, during a business briefing, about the personnel in the Chicago operation, whether there was anyone he needed to reach directly. There was a woman, Hyejin said, in the tone of someone producing a mildly unpleasant fact. She had been working close to you for a period of time before the accident. The consensus among your people in Chicago was that her interest was financial. She made certain claims after the explosion. She is no longer involved with anything connected to you. He filed it. No emotional reaction. How could there be? With no emotional context. Just a fact in the growing inventory of his life. 3 weeks later, during a different conversation, unprompted, the woman from Chicago contacted the organization again. She was advised not to do so. She was claiming the children were yours. Your men handled the situation. A pause. I want you to know because I believe you deserve transparency. But I also want you to understand the doctors flagged her behavior as a pattern of exploitation toward wealthy men in vulnerable situations. I wouldn't mention it again, except that I don't want you blindsided. He absorbed this. Said nothing. Filed it in the same place as the first piece, where the two now sat beside each other in his mind, like items in a drawer he rarely opened. He did not feel the thing he would have expected to feel. He felt nothing, which was how he knew the door was still closed. Because behind it, he suspected, was the reason the nothing felt so loud. 600 miles away, in a hospital in Chicago, Sanaa Whitmore was delivering 2 boys alone. No one held her hand. A nurse she had worked the night shift with twice held one hand for the first hour and then had to return to her station. After that, it was just Sanaa and the doctors and the 2 small bodies that arrived, one after the other, furious and perfect, and completely unaware of what they were being born into. She named them before she fell asleep. Malik. Because it meant king, and she was determined that her sons would know what they were before the world told them otherwise. Asher. Because it meant happy, and she needed at least one of their names to be a prayer. She lay in the hospital room afterward with 1 baby on each side and the silence of 3 in the morning around her, and she looked at their faces already so specific, already so entirely themselves, and she made a decision that she kept making. Every morning after that, for the next 5 years. She was going to be enough. She was going to be enough for both of them. And if the man who was supposed to be here never came, if he had chosen something over this, or been taken from it, or simply erased them from his mind, the way you erase a debt you have decided not to pay, then she was going to make sure her sons never had cause to feel the weight of that absence in their bones. She did not know if she succeeded. She tried. Back in Busan, Kyren was standing at the window of the rehabilitation facility when the first real flashback happened. Not a dream. Not the vague impressions that drifted in before sleep. A full sensory intrusion, sudden and ungoverned, lasting perhaps 4 seconds, and leaving him gripping the windowsill with both hands and breathing like he had been hit. A hospital room. The sound of a heartbeat on a monitor. A small screen showing 2 shadows, 2 movements, 2 flickering lives. A woman's hand in his. Then it was gone. He stood at the window for a long time. His reflection looked back at him from the glass, composed, still, giving nothing away, and he studied it like a stranger he was trying to identify from a photograph. Behind him, the door opened. Hyejin entered with the neurologist. "Good afternoon," she said. "How are you feeling?" He turned from the window. "Fine," he said. The closed door stayed closed. But something on the other side of it had just moved. He recovered. He was trained to recover. He returned to the organization, sharp and efficient, and colder than before, in the specific way that happens when the parts of a person that generate warmth have gone underground. His lieutenants noted it privately as improvement, steadier, less emotional, more predictable. What they called strength, Kyren would have recognized as loss, if he had known what was lost. He didn't. Hyejin watched him resume power with the satisfaction of someone whose blueprint had survived construction intact. She had given him back his empire. She had given him nothing else. And the man who had once sat in a small apartment in Lincoln Square eating badly cooked food and laughing without warning and sleeping peacefully for the first time in years, moved through his days in Seoul like a man solving problems. Efficient, unreachable, and completely unaware that the thing he was missing was not a memory. It was a family. What does it do to a man when the people closest to him shape what he's allowed to remember? Drop a comment because the answer to that question is about to come back with interest. Chapter 5. The alarm went off at 5:15 every morning. Sanaa was always awake before it. She had developed, somewhere in the second year of doing this alone, the involuntary habit of waking at 5:10 as if her body understood that the alarm was a luxury she could not afford, that those 5 minutes before it sounded were the only quiet she was going to get before the day started pulling at her from every direction. She lay there in the dark and listened to her apartment breathe. Twin beds through the wall, twin heartbeats she could not actually hear but had somehow, over 4 years, learned to feel. The specific quality of silence that meant both boys were still asleep versus the different quality that meant one of them was awake and lying still, pretending not to be, which was Asher's particular gift, the capacity for stillness that made her worry in ways she could not name. Wudent Sherwufen. The alarm. She turned it off before the second pulse and got up. The routine had the density of something load-bearing. Coffee while the boys' lunches were made, sandwiches, fruit, the granola bars that Malik claimed not to like but which disappeared from his bag every single day, breakfast that looked like enough. Uniforms checked for cleanliness in the way only a working mother checks things fast, thorough, filing away the information that Asher's left sleeve had a small tear she would fix tonight if she had the energy, and the weekend if she didn't. School drop-off at 7:40. Hospital by 8:15. Still in the half-awake state she'd learned to function from. She was 4 months into a schedule that had her on day shift 3 days a week and evening shift 2 days, with 1 full Saturday and 4, and every third Sunday. The hospital had been generous, by institutional standards. Generous by institutional standards meant that the math still did not work without the calculations she ran in her head every Thursday when the week's schedule clarified. Rent, the 15th, fixed. Utilities, variable, terrifying in winter. School supplies. Malik needed new cleats for the basketball program. She had been delaying that conversation. Groceries. Never above a specific number. She had an internal calculator for this that ran automatically in stores, tallying as she moved through the aisles, so practiced it no longer required her conscious attention. She had not bought anything for herself in 4 months. She had stopped tracking that. Malik had started getting into trouble at school in September. Nothing severe. Not yet. Talking back to teachers, missing assignments that he was capable of completing, one incident in the hallway that the assistant principal described as a confrontation in the careful tone adults use when they don't want to say the word fight. Sanaa sat across from the assistant principal and listened to all of it and thanked him and walked out and drove to the parking lot 2 blocks away and sat in her car for 9 minutes before she was ready to be a nurse again. She understood what was happening with Malik. She was not naive about it. She had read enough and lived enough and been honest enough with herself in the dark hours to know that the anger in her son was not random. Adolescent boys with absent fathers and overextended mothers sometimes express the specific pain of that equation, outward found edges to press against. Found conflict as a way of existing loudly in a world that felt like it had not entirely made room for them. She knew that. Understanding it did not make sitting across from assistant principals easier. Asher was different. Asher had always been different, even as a baby, the quieter of the two. The one who processed things internally before showing anything outside. Where Malik expressed, Asher absorbed. He was doing well in school. His grades were strong. His teachers sent home positive notes. He had 2 close friends whose mothers Sanaa knew and liked and occasionally traded schedule favors with. But Asher watched her. He had always watched her. With the careful, steady attention of a child who understood more than he was supposed to, who had been reading adult situations since he was small enough that adults forgot to calibrate what they said around him. He watched her come home from double shifts, with her jaw set in the particular way she held it, when exhaustion was competing with determination. He watched her check the mail and then put the mail away quickly. He watched her laugh at dinner, and then sit very still for a moment afterward, as if the laugh had reminded her of something. He never asked directly. But once, on a Tuesday evening, he came into the kitchen while she was doing dishes and stood next to her for a while without speaking, and then said, in the conversational tone he used for everything, "You don't have to be okay all the time. You know that, right?" She had looked at him. This exact child. She said, "I know, baby." He nodded, apparently satisfied, and left. She finished the dishes and cried briefly and silently, and then went to check on their homework. The question came from Malik. It always came from Malik, because Asher processed, and Malik asked. That was the division of labor between them, the one thing that made them 2 separate people clearly. Because in everything else, they moved through the world with a coordination that sometimes felt less like 2 brothers, and more like one person in 2 bodies. They were 8 years old, a Sunday afternoon, rain outside, and both of them bored enough that they'd started looking for anything to fill the time when Malik appeared in the kitchen doorway and said, with the complete directness of children who have not yet learned that questions can be timed, "Where's our dad?" Sanaa was making rice. She did not turn around. "Your father is away," she said. Same words, the words she had practiced. Away where? He had to go somewhere. It was complicated. How long has he been away? She stirred the rice. A while. Malik was quiet for a moment. Then, "Deja's dad is away too, and she says he's in prison. Is that where our dad is?" "No." "Then where?" She turned around then because the rice was not going to do this part for her. She looked at her son, 8 years old, Kyren's exact eyes in her son's face, patient and direct, and already containing the specific quality of a person who could wait out silences, and she said, "He's far away, Malik. I don't know when he's coming back. But what I know for sure is that the 2 of you have everything you need right here." Malik considered this. "That's not an answer," he said. He sounded exactly like her. He also sounded exactly like his father. She turned back to the rice. "I know," she said. "Eat lunch." She cried in bathrooms. That was the geography of grief. When you are a mother with 2 sons and a full-time job and a public face, you find the only room with a lock on it, and you take your 60 seconds and you wash your face with cold water, and you go back out. She did this on birthdays most consistently. The twins' birthdays were in March. She organized the parties with the comprehensive logistics of someone who understood that children do not remember how much money was spent, but do remember whether the room felt like celebration. She made the cakes herself, chocolate for Malik, lemon for Asher, and organized the guests and set up the yard and ran the whole day on the specific adrenaline of someone determined that her children would have full, lit-up, laughing child days that contained no shadow of what was missing. And then, after the last guest left and both boys were asleep and the house was quiet with leftover cake and deflating balloons, she went to the bathroom. She locked the door. She sat on the edge of the tub and pressed her hands over her face and let it out for exactly as long as she could afford before she needed to be functional again. Then she washed her face. Then she went to bed. She did this 4 birthdays in a row. 6,000 miles away in Seoul, in the 4th year after the accident, Kyren sat at his desk at 2 in the morning with his third untouched glass of water and a blank sheet of paper in front of him. He had been reaching for a pen to write something, a note, a decision. He no longer remembered what, when his hand had found the pen and moved without being told, and now he was looking at what it had drawn. Small shoes. The same ones. He had drawn them 7 times this month. Different sizes, different angles, always the same basic shape, small, soft-soled, the kind worn by someone who was just learning to walk. He stared at them. The headache was beginning at the base of his skull. He did not throw the paper away this time. He folded it, put it in the desk drawer, in the back, where he kept the other things he did not understand and could not discard. The drawer was getting full. The winter Malik turned 14 was the winter Chicago froze without apology. The radiator in Sanaa's apartment was unreliable in the specific, personal way that old radiators become functioning on its own schedule, responsive to no logic, delivering heat in the early morning and withdrawing it by evening, so that by 9 o'clock every night, the apartment had the particular cold that seeped up through old floors. Sanaa had put extra blankets on both beds. She had not put an extra blanket on her own. She was doing the month's financial review at the kitchen table, the same Thursday exercise, the same internal arithmetic, the same conclusion that the number at the bottom was smaller than the number that the month required when her phone buzzed. A reminder about Malik's basketball game Friday. She looked at the reminder. She remembered, 4 years ago, Asher telling her, "You don't have to be okay all the time." She looked at the kitchen window, where frost had built up at the corners in the particular intricate way frost does when temperatures drop below a threshold. She looked at the financial spreadsheet. She looked at her phone. She closed the spreadsheet. Some things the math cannot reach. She went to bed. The radiator, in its perverse way, kicked on at midnight and was warm and steady until exactly 5:10 the next morning. Friday came. The gym was loud and bright and smelled of basketball courts everywhere, rubber and effort, and the particular social electricity of teenagers performing for whoever is watching. Sanaa sat 3 rows up in her scrubs, still exhausted, eating pretzels, watching her son move across the court with the particular grace he had been developing all year, fast, light-footed, always 3 decisions ahead of where the ball currently was. He was good. Not in the encouraging way that mothers say their children are good at things. Actually good, the kind that other parents noticed and pointed out to her, that the coaches spoke about with a different quality in their voices. She watched him and felt the particular overwhelm of loving someone so completely that their capability is almost physically painful to witness, because the better he became, the more she could see a future for him, and the more she could see a future, the more clearly she could also see all the places where she needed to be enough to get him there. She was eating the last of the pretzels when Malik made the cut left toward the basket. She saw him reach the baseline. She saw his form correct, exactly as practiced. She saw him leave the floor. And then she did not see him land, because he did not land the way people land. He simply fell. And the basketball hit the floor a moment later, rolling away toward the baseline like it had already decided it had nothing to do with this. In the ambulance, she held his hand. In the emergency room, she translated her fear into clinical language because it was the only language the situation accepted. In the hallway, she stood against the wall and breathed. The doctor said what he said about the blood disorder. He said what he said about the genetic history. He said what he said about next time. And Sanaa stood there holding the phone that had no name for that contact, only a number, only a memory, only the specific weight of 5 years of silence, and she thought about Malik's face when she tried to answer his questions and couldn't. She thought about Asher saying you don't have to be okay all the time. She thought about all the birthdays. She thought about the space on the other side of the locked bathroom door where the grief went when it had nowhere else. She pressed call. The phone rang. Once. Twice. 3 times. Long enough that she had already started building herself against the voicemail, already rehearsing the 20 words she would leave that would be enough to get the medical information without containing any of the other things. He answered. 1 word. Yes. and the 5 years between them collapsed into a single breath. He was in Seoul. She was in a hospital hallway in Chicago. Malik was crashing behind a curtain 12 feet away. And the man on the other end of the line, the man she had loved and mourned and raised 2 sons to look exactly like, was pressing his knuckles to his temple because something in his skull had just detonated, and the images were coming fast now, too fast, unstoppable in a way they had never been before. A hospital room, an ultrasound screen, rain against a window, a woman's laugh, her laugh. He knew it. He did not know how he knew it, but he knew it the same way. You know a sound that has always lived inside you and suddenly has a direction. Who? His voice broke. He tried again. Who is this? Behind Sanaa, a machine changed tone. A nurse raised her voice. The doctor appeared at the curtain. She looked at her son. She looked at the phone. And the things she had been holding for 5 years, the grief and the anger and the love she could never fully kill, no matter how much easier it would have made her life broke through every wall she had built around it. You have sons, Kyren. Silence. The specific silence of a world rearranging itself on both ends of a call. She pressed on before she could stop herself, before the old protection could reassemble. 2 of them, 14 years old. Her voice did not shake. She had run out of the energy that shaking required. One of them is in the hospital right now, and I need to know your medical history, or the doctors can't help him. More silence. Then, so quietly she almost missed it. They told me you. He stopped. She heard him stop. She heard what was in the stop. Her hand tightened on the phone. What did they tell you, Kyren? Not a question. A door being kicked open. They told me. He stopped again. Differently this time, as if the sentences he had been given 5 years ago were suddenly arranged wrong, and rearranging them required something he was only now finding. They said you were that you had. We didn't die, Sanaa said. The word landed in the silence between continents, like something physical. They told you we died. It wasn't a question either. She knew the answer. She had known it for 5 years in the part of her that refused to fully accept either version of the story that he had chosen to leave, or that he had simply stopped existing because neither version had ever felt entirely true. And the thing that is not entirely true is usually the thing you have not yet found the courage to know. On the other side of the world, Kyren Tae-Min Valez sat completely still. The drawer in his desk was full of folded papers. The door inside him, the one that had been closed for 5 years, the one the headaches lived behind, the one whose handle he could never find was open, wide open. And on the other side of it was everything. There's a moment in every betrayal where someone had to make a choice. Hyejin made hers. Now Kyren has to make his. But before he does, what do you think is in those desk drawers? Because what a man saves when he doesn't know why he's saving it, that says more about him than anything he remembers. Drop your thoughts below. Chapter 6 is where this phone call stops being a conversation and starts being a reckoning, and you do not want to miss what Kyren does in the next 12 hours. Chapter 6. The phone was still warm in his hand when Kyren stood up from the desk. He did not decide to stand. His body simply refused to remain seated under the weight of what had just entered it. 2 words, spoken across 6,000 miles of ocean and silence and 5 years of engineered forgetting, landing with the force of something that had always been true and had simply been buried alive. They told you we died. He was across the room before he registered moving. His hand found the desk drawer, the back one, the full one, and pulled it open, and the folded papers spilled out across the desk surface. 7 of them. 8. More than he had counted. All the same. Small shoes. Rain on glass. The outline of a face his hand had been trying to finish for years without being given permission to know whose face it was. He stared at them. His hands were shaking in a way that had nothing to do with cold. The headache was there, the usual one. The one he had lived with so long it had become background noise, except now it was not background noise. Now it was a door blowing open in a storm, frame and all, and everything behind it was coming through at once, whether he was ready or not. A hospital room. The sound of 2 heartbeats. Her voice times, you can threaten everybody else later, Right now, stay alive times. And then the same voice, 5 years older and 3,000 words quieter, saying times you have sons. Kyren times with the flatness of someone who had already spent every version of this moment alone and was not performing it now, just delivering it, the way you deliver a fact that has been true for a long time, regardless of whether anyone acknowledged it. He picked up the phone. He called back. She answered on the first ring. "Tell me what the doctors need," he said. No preamble. No explanation. There was no time for either, and the part of him that had been running an empire for 5 years understood how to operate under urgency, even when his hands were shaking and his chest felt like something structural had given way inside. She told him. He listened the way he had always listened to her completely, without interrupting, with the quality of attention that had unnerved her in the beginning, because men in his position rarely listened to anyone as if the words actually mattered. She gave him the medical information the doctors needed. He asked 2 questions, both specific, both clinical, both exactly what the situation required. Then he said, "I'll have my medical records transmitted to the attending within the hour. Whatever they need from me directly, I'll be available." A pause. "Kyren, I'm here." She did not say what she almost said. He heard it anyway, the particular quality of held-back words that had its own sound when you knew someone well enough to read the silence they left. "Go be with your son," he said. She went. He stood alone in his office at 2 a.m. in Seoul and looked at the drawings on his desk. Then he picked up a different phone. Not his business line. The older one. The one with a contact list that predated Busan and the rehabilitation facility and everything Hyejin had rebuilt around him in the years since the accident. He scrolled to a name. Devonte Reese Okafor. His oldest bodyguard. The one who had been with him since Chicago. The one who had gone quiet in the years after the accident, in the way that men go quiet when they are carrying something they have been told not to speak. The phone rang twice. "Boss." The voice was careful, alert, despite the hour. "I need to ask you something," Kyren said. "And I need you to answer me like it's the last honest conversation either of us is ever going to have." A long pause. "Ask," Devonte said. "The woman in Chicago. Sanaa Whitmore." He kept his voice level. What actually happened? The silence that followed was not empty. It was full dense with the specific weight of a man deciding whether the truth was going to cost him more than the lie had already cost everyone else. Then Devonte said, "You need to sit down for this." "I'm already standing." "Then hold on to something." He talked for 22 minutes. Kyren did not interrupt once. Devonte told him about the surveillance that started 4 months before the explosion. He told him about the meeting near O'Hare, the one he had learned about 3 weeks after the fact, too late, from a driver who had been in the building. He told him what the meeting had contained, and what the envelope had held, and who had ordered it. He told him that the vehicle had been prepared for a specific day, a specific passenger, and that the passenger was not supposed to be Kyren. That Kyren had changed his schedule. That he had gotten into the vehicle 40 minutes early because he had been on the phone with Sanaa, Devonte believed, though he had not been close enough to hear, and the call had made him want to return to the penthouse faster than planned. That the bomb had been timed for a window Kyren arrived in only because love made him impatient. That Sanaa had been the intended target. That the babies had been the intended targets. That the explosion took the wrong person, and Hyejin had turned the mistake into an opportunity without breaking stride, because a comatose Kyren with brain trauma was almost as useful as a dead Sanaa, if you had access to his recovery environment and enough time to do the work. Devonte stopped talking. The silence stretched. "Why didn't you tell me?" Kyren said. Not an accusation. A genuine question. He understood the answer before it came. "She had eyes everywhere in that facility," Devonte said. "And I had seen what happened to the last man who crossed her. I had a daughter, Kyren. I had..." He stopped. Started again. "I should have told you. I know what I should have done. I've known for 5 years. There isn't a morning I don't wake up with it." Kyren said nothing for a moment. "The boys," he said finally. "Are they safe?" "Sanaa keeps them close. She's not connected to anything. Nobody's touched them. I don't think Hyejin believed they were real enough to be worth the attention once you were neutralized. She underestimated." He paused. She underestimated Sanaa. Everybody does, Kyren said. He hung up. He sat down, then not because he was ready to sit, but because his body made the decision for him, the way bodies do when the mind has received more than it can process upright. He sat in the dark in his office in Seoul and looked at the drawings on his desk. He thought about his son in a hospital bed in Chicago. He thought about another son, somewhere in the same city, sleeping without knowing tonight was the night the world was about to change. He thought about a woman in a hospital hallway holding a phone to her ear, and 5 years of surviving something that should not have been survivable. And then he thought about Hyejin. The thought was very clean, very quiet, very specific. The kind of thought that does not require any emotion to execute, that sits below emotion, in the part of a person that simply decides and then moves. He picked up his third phone. "Get me on the first flight to Chicago," he said. Before Chapter 7 pulls back the curtain on every document Hyejin buried, ask yourself this. If Devante had spoken 5 years ago, would any of this have happened? Some silences protect people. Some silences destroy them. Tell us which kind this was in the comments below. Chapter 7. The flight from Seoul to Chicago is 14 hours. Kyren spent none of them sleeping. He spent them on a laptop with a secured connection, working through files that Devante had been quietly collecting and preserving for 5 years with the particular care of a man who understood that evidence is the only weapon that survives the death of its holder. Devante had been thorough, more thorough than Kyren had known to be grateful for, until now. There were financial transfer records routed through 4 shell companies, each one a layer of distance from the Valez name, but with patterns that a forensic accountant could follow if they knew where to start. Large movements in the weeks before the explosion. Payments to a logistics company that, when traced, dissolved into a name Kyren recognized as one of 3 contractors the syndicate used for operations that required total deniability. There were medical files, his own. The originals, from the Busan facility, not the versions Hyejin's people had in their records, but the ones the admitting physician had filed before Hyejin had full control of the environment. The difference between the 2 versions was not dramatic. It did not need to be. It was the difference between a prognosis that said Time's memory recovery is likely within 6 to 18 months, with appropriate stimulation and honest environmental input times, and a management plan that said Time's patient should be protected from stressors, including contact with previous personal relationships during recovery. Protected from stressors. That was what they had called it. Kyren read that line 3 times. He felt nothing in the way that a person feels nothing when the temperature of something is beyond the range the body was built to register. There were witness statements. 2 of them, given voluntarily, in writing, with dates and signatures. One from the driver who had been on Lakeshore Drive that morning and survived by being 40 yards behind the vehicle. One from a clinic worker in Busan who had twice been asked to adjust patient records, and had done so once, and refused the second time, and been quietly transferred to a different facility. The clinic worker's statement was 11 pages. Kyren read every word. By hour 8 of the flight, he had a complete picture. By hour 10, he had a plan. By hour 14, he was on the ground in Chicago in January with the kind of cold that hits you like a physical announcement. And Devante was waiting at the arrivals exit in a dark coat, older than Kyren remembered, carrying the specific expression of a man who had been waiting a long time to do something useful. They did not embrace. They stood for a moment. Then Kyren said, "Take me to the hospital." He did not call ahead. He walked through the lobby of Northwestern Memorial at 7 in the morning, still in the same clothes he had boarded the flight in, and followed Devante through a route that suggested Devante had been to this hospital before, more than once, more than recently. Kyren noted this, filed it. Sanaa was in the family waiting room on the pediatric floor. She was asleep in a chair with her coat over her like a blanket, her head tipped slightly to one side, her hospital badge still clipped to her chest from the shift she had gone to before the game. One hand was curled loose in her lap. One was wrapped around a paper coffee cup that had long gone cold. He stood in the doorway. He had been building himself for this building, the version of himself that could walk into a room and function, that could manage the gap between what he now knew and what he needed to do with that knowledge. He had built it across 14 hours, and he had believed the construction was solid. It was not solid. The moment he saw her, the specific reality of her, not the memory that had been trying to surface for 5 years, but the actual present tense person sitting in a hospital chair with her coat for a blanket because she had been here all night and there was no one else to be here. Every piece of that construction came apart. He stood in the doorway until he trusted his face. Then he walked in. He sat in the chair across from her. He did not wake her. He had taken enough from her. He could give her 10 more minutes of sleep. He sat and looked at his hands and thought about the fact that somewhere down the hall, behind a door, was a 14-year-old boy he had never met, who had been born in this city, into a silence that was not supposed to exist, and that boy had his blood running through him, and that blood was currently failing in a way that Kyren's own brother had died from 30 years ago, on a different continent. His brother. He had not thought about Jaewon clearly in years. The memory had been accessible but flat. The way grief goes flat when the rest of a person's emotional life has been managed into a controlled space. Now the memory arrived with its full weight, and it was not flat at all. Jaewon had been 23. The same blood disorder. Different generation. And nobody had known in time. And now there was a boy down the hall who was 14 and had Kyren's blood and Sanaa's stubbornness and a name she had chosen for him before he was born in a hospital room with nobody holding her hand. Sanaa's eyes opened. She was alert immediately, the nurse's reflex, awake to functional in under a second, and then she saw him, and the alert turned into something else. Not surprise exactly. More like the look of someone who had been waiting for a thing and had stopped believing it would arrive and is now recalibrating. They looked at each other. Neither spoke for a moment. "Malik is stable," she said finally. "The nurse first. Always the nurse first. They got what they needed from your records. The treatment protocol is working." He exhaled. The first clean exhale in 14 hours. "I need to see him," he said. "He's asleep. I know. He stopped. She watched him. "I just need to see him," he said again. Quieter. Not a demand, something underneath a demand. She stood up. She walked to the hallway. She glanced back once, not to check his intentions. He understood, but with the look of someone conducting one final internal assessment before something irreversible, and then she walked and he followed and they went down the hall without speaking. The room was quiet. Malik was in the bed with the particular boneless relaxation of teenagers in deep sleep. One arm thrown over the edge, his size 12 sneakers sitting on the floor beside the bed like they had been kicked off without ceremony. Kyren stood in the doorway. He could not move for a moment. The boy had his jaw. He had Sanaa's mouth and her forehead and the specific slope of her cheekbones, but the jaw was his. And the hands even relaxed and open on the blanket. The shape of them was his. He had not understood, until this moment, how much of himself he had been living without. He stepped back from the doorway. He pressed his back against the wall in the hallway, and tipped his head back, and closed his eyes. Sanaa stood 2 feet away and did not touch him, and did not speak because she understood, still, which moments required words, and which ones did not. After a moment, he said, "I need to tell you everything. I know. It's going to be hard to hear. Kyren." Her voice was very quiet. "I raised 2 boys alone for 5 years on a nurse's salary because I didn't know if you were dead or if you had decided we weren't worth coming back for. Whatever you're about to tell me is not going to be the hardest thing I've heard this week." He looked at her. "Sit down," she said. They sat on the bench in the hallway. He told her, all of it. She did not cry. He had expected, he did not know what he had expected. Something, some visible fracture to match the size of what he was telling her. Instead, she sat very still and listened, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the night shift nurses finished handoff down the hall and the morning light changed quality in the windows, and a cart rattled past them on its way somewhere. Then she said, "How much of it can you prove? Not times I can't believe this. Not times how could she? Not anything that was about feeling before functioning. How much of it can you prove? That was Sanaa Whitmore. That had always been Sanaa Whitmore. Enough, he said. But I need access to one more set of records. The financial transfers from the week before the explosion. The originals are in the Valez Group server, the Chicago office, not Seoul. Can you get them? Yes. Then get them, she said. And then, she paused. Then what? He thought about the plan he had built on the flight. The banquet in Seoul, the annual Valez Group gathering, already scheduled for 3 weeks from now. The entire organization present. Politicians, executives, the people who believed Haejin's version of everything because they had only ever been given Haejin's version of everything. He told Sanaa. She listened. When he finished, she looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read, something between recognition and assessment. You want to expose her publicly, she said. In front of everyone she's built her authority over. Yes. And us. She held his eyes. You want us to be there. I want them to see you. I want them to see the boys. He said it steadily. I know that's a large thing to ask. I know I don't have the standing to ask it. But the evidence is stronger with you in the room than with a projection screen alone. And he stopped. Something crossed his face, and I want her to see what she tried to erase. I want her to sit in a room full of witnesses and understand that it's still here, that you're still here. Sanaa was quiet for a moment. I'll think about it, she said, which, from Sanaa, meant yes. He knew that. He stood. He looked down the hall toward Malik's room. The other one, he said. Asher. The name in his mouth for the first time. He's at school. He doesn't know you're here yet. I know, he looked at her. When do we tell him? She met his eyes, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. And in that moment, everything that had been broken and everything that might still be built existed at the same time in the hallway between them. Soon, she said. But we do it together. He nodded. He went to get the records. What Haejin buried was about to be projected on a screen in front of everyone who believed her. But before Chapter 8, what do you think she does when she realizes Kyren knows? Because powerful people don't go quietly, and Haejin had never gone quietly in her life. Chapter 8. The invitation to the banquet read like every other annual Valez Group gathering. Private, formal. The kind of event where men in suits discussed money and language designed to sound like anything except what it actually was. The Sheila Seoul, Grand Ballroom, 3rd Saturday of January. Dinner at 7. Remarks at 9. Haejin had organized it herself, as she had for the past 6 years. She had also organized, with the same efficiency, the seating arrangement that placed her at Kyren's right, close enough to monitor, far enough to appear simply familial. The guest list she had curated personally. 12 politicians across 3 jurisdictions, 9 executives from partner organizations, 7 members of the syndicate's inner financial circle, and 4 attorneys who handled the kind of legal scaffolding that kept everything above ground looking clean. She was, as she always was before these events, prepared for everything. She had not prepared for Kyren to be quiet. That was the first signal. He had arrived in Seoul 4 days before the banquet, returning from what he had told her was a brief operational trip to the United States, vague, not unprecedented. She had not pressed. But since his return, he had been different in a way she could not precisely locate. Not cold, he had been cold since Busan. She had built that into the architecture of his recovery. Something else. A quality of stillness that was not the stillness she had manufactured. This was the stillness of someone who had already made every decision. She had seen it before. She had seen it in her brother, once, the month before he died. She pushed the thought away. The night of the banquet arrived with the particular beauty that Seoul produced in winter clear sky. The city lit against it. The kind of night that looked expensive from a distance, and was. The ballroom was exactly as she had arranged it. Round tables, heavy linens, lighting calibrated to make everyone look slightly more important than they were. The guests arrived in the sequence she anticipated. The drinks were correct. The conversations moved through their expected channels. Kyren arrived at 7:15, in a dark suit. He looked like himself, the version of himself the organization knew. Composed, authoritative. The room adjusted to his presence the way rooms always did, conversations briefly recalibrating toward him, like something magnetic. He greeted people. He shook hands. He said the correct things. He did not look at Haejin with any particular expression. That was the second signal. She watched him move through the room and felt something she did not allow herself to name, a quality of attention she had carried for 61 years. The kind that had kept her alive in rooms full of people who underestimated her, now turned inward and finding an answer it did not like. At 8:50, the guests moved toward their seats. Kyren moved toward the front of the room. Haejin assumed he was preparing to take his place at the head table. He was not. He stopped in front of the room's presentation screen, the one used annually for financial summaries and strategic projections, and a man Haejin did not recognize moved to a laptop at the side of the room, and the screen, which should have displayed the Valez Group annual summary, displayed instead a single document, a financial transfer record, dated 5 years and 3 weeks ago. Haejin looked at it. She did not move. She did not allow her face to change. The room had gone still in the way rooms go still when something has occurred that nobody yet understands but everyone can feel. "I'd like to show you something," Kyren said. His voice carried without effort. It always had. The room gave it the particular silence that power commands, except this time, the power was not in his position or his reputation. It was in the quality of a man who had nothing left to protect, and therefore nothing left to manage. He was calm in the way of someone who is done. 5 years ago, he said, I was in an explosion on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. You all know this. The organization was told it was a cartel attack, a rival operation, an occupational consequence. He paused. It was not. He nodded to the man at the laptop. The next document appeared. Then the next. Transfer records. Medical files, 2 versions of the same file, side by side. Differences, highlighted in a way that required no explanation. A contractor invoice from a logistics company. A written statement from a man named Devonte Reese Okafor. Dated, signed, notarized 3 days ago. Then the clinic worker's 11 pages. He let them read. The room was completely silent. At the back, one of the executives leaned toward his attorney. The attorney put a hand on his arm. Not to reassure. To stop him from doing anything visible. Haejin sat at the head table. She had not moved since the first document appeared. She was, still, the most composed person in the room. That was the thing about Haejin. She was not a person who collapsed under pressure. She was a person who calcified, who became, under threat, more herself. She looked at Kyren across the room. He looked back. These documents, she said, her voice carrying the measured authority of 61 years of rooms like this, represent a highly selective interpretation of, I'd like you to meet someone, Kyren said. The ballroom doors opened. Sanaa walked in with her hand around Asher's shoulder. Malik walked on her other side slower than usual, still carrying the recent hospital stay in the slight carefulness of his movement, but upright and present and looking around the room with his father's direct gaze in his mother's composed face. The room did not make a sound. It was not dramatic silence, not the held-breath silence of performance. It was the silence of 40 people simultaneously processing something that could not be denied and did not require narration. The boys looked like Kyren, not resembled, not suggested, looked like him bone deep, generational, the kind of physical inheritance that is its own form of evidence and requires no documentation. Sanaa walked them to the front of the room. She did not look at Haejin. She looked at Kyren. And the look she gave him was not forgiveness, and it was not love, and it was not the absence of either of those things. It was the look of a woman who had decided to be in this room for specific reasons that belonged entirely to her, and who was here on her own terms, and who would leave on her own terms, and who was not performing any part of it. Kyren looked at his sons. Malik looked back at him. The directness of it, the complete, unafraid, 14-year-old directness of a boy who had learned not to flinch from things, hit Kyren somewhere that the documents and the flight and the investigation had not reached. The part that was not the plan. The part that was just the fact. Asher looked at him too quieter, more measuring, with the specific patience of a child who waits to understand before he responds. Taking inventory. Deciding what was true. Haejin's voice broke the silence. She manipulated him. Her voice was controlled, but a different kind of controlled, not authority. The last version of authority. The one that sounds like authority because it has forgotten how to sound like anything else. She is here because she wants access to this organization, and she used those children. If my dad loved us, Malik said, why did you try to make us disappear? The question was not loud. It was not angry. It was the conversational directness of a 14-year-old who had spent his whole life asking questions that adults deflected and had simply run out of patience for the deflection. It landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Several people looked at the table. A politician near the back cleared his throat and did not say anything. One of the attorneys stood up, then sat back down. Haejin looked at Malik. For the first time in the evening, her composure had a seam in it not visible to most people in the room, but visible to Kyren, who had been raised by this woman and knew where the seams were. She said nothing. The room understood the silence. Not intellectually, emotionally. In the specific way that a room full of people who have built careers on reading situations reads a situation when someone who has never been at a loss for words has no words. Evil, as Malik had accidentally proven, sounds smaller when a child names it plainly. The evening did not end dramatically. That was the thing about real moments, they rarely did. No single confrontation, no final speech, no moment where everything resolved cleanly into the shape of a conclusion. Instead, a gathering that broke apart in pieces. Attorneys moving toward each other in low voices. Executives excusing themselves from the table with the body language of people recalculating their positions. A politician who left without saying goodbye to anyone. Two members of the inner financial circle approached Kyren separately before the night was over and told him they had questions about the transfer records. Those questions were the beginning of everything that followed. Haejin was escorted from the ballroom by two men, not law enforcement, not yet, but the kind of quiet removal that precedes law enforcement in organizations where the internal reckoning runs faster than the external one. She walked out of the room with her back straight and her hands still. She did not look at Sanaa. She did not look at the boys. She looked at Kyren once, at the door. His face gave her nothing. She left. And the room slowly, unevenly, with the particular awkwardness of powerful people who had been present for something they had not anticipated and would need time to determine the implications of, began to empty. Kyren stood with his sons for the first time. The three of them in a clearing in the middle of a room that was still settling around them. Malik looked up at him with the expression of someone conducting an assessment that would take longer than tonight. Asher said nothing for a moment. Then, are you staying? The question was simple. It was the only question that mattered. Kyren looked at Sanaa. She was watching him with that same quality of waiting, not hoping, not warning, simply waiting for the true answer. Yes, he said. Asher nodded once. Then he looked around the emptying ballroom with the expression of a child who has processed a significant amount of information and is deciding where to file it. This place has really good lighting, he said. Malik snorted. And in the middle of a room full of the wreckage of an empire, the four of them stood together for the first time. And someone laughed. The truth walked into that room and did not leave. But the real story, the one that started after the banquet, was the one nobody photographs or documents. The one that happens in kitchens and school hallways and on ordinary Tuesday evenings when nobody is watching. That story is next. Stay close. Final chapter. 3 weeks after Seoul, on a Wednesday morning, Kyren burned the eggs. Not metaphorically. Literally. Standing at Sanaa's stove in Lincoln Square in a borrowed apron because he had not owned one, had never, in his adult life, owned an apron trying to make scrambled eggs from a recipe Asher had found online and insisted was simple, and managing to produce something that was brown on the bottom and wet on top in a way that suggested the heat had been wrong from the beginning. He stood looking at the pan. You need to move them more, Asher said from the kitchen table without looking up from his homework. You can't just leave them. I was told not to overstir. There's a difference between overstirring and ignoring them. Kyren looked at his younger son. Asher continued working on his math problem with the specific serenity of a child who has been right about something and sees no need to oversell it. Kyren scraped the pan. Started again. This was what the weeks looked like. Not a reunion in the cinematic sense, not a sequence of emotional moments building to a healed family tableau. What it looked like was eggs. And school drop-offs in a car that was too expensive for the Lincoln Square parking situation and that Kyren was learning to parallel park in because he had, apparently, always had someone else to do that. And sitting in the pediatric follow-up appointments where Malik's treatment was being monitored, listening to doctors explain things he partly understood from the research he had done on the flight to Chicago and partly needed Sanaa to translate because she was faster and more precise with the clinical language. What it looked like was Malik's silence. Malik had not said much since Seoul. Not angrily. Not with the specific wall building that Sanaa had been watching in him for 2 years, the defensive kind of silence that pressed outward. This was a different quality. More like a boy who had received significant information and was deciding what to do with it in private before doing anything with it in public. Sanaa watched and waited. She knew Malik. She understood that pushing him was the fastest way to make him go sideways, and that space was not indifference, that sometimes the most loving thing was to let someone have their own time with something. Kyren did not know Malik yet, and Malik, in the way of 14-year-olds who are assessing a new element in their environment, made him prove that before he let him in. He tested it practically, the way he tested everything. One evening, 2 weeks after Chicago, he left his basketball on the stairs, not accidentally, Sanaa observed, but with the deliberate placement of someone setting up an experiment, to see if it would be noticed, to see if anything would be said. Kyren tripped over it. He did not yell. He did not make it dramatic. He just picked the ball up and looked at it for a moment and then held it out to Malik, who was watching from the couch with the expression of someone pretending not to watch. "Show me something," Kyren said. Malik stared at him. "On the court. Show me what you can do." He turned the ball in his hands. "I've heard you're good." "Who said that?" "Your mother, your coach, Devontae, who apparently has been to more of your games than I knew." Something shifted in Malik's face. Quickly, almost undetectably. "Devontae came to my games? For the past 2 years. Your mother doesn't know. He just..." Kyren paused. He was trying to do something right when he couldn't do the thing he should have done. It's not enough. But it was something. Malik looked at the ball. Then he stood up. "There's a court 3 blocks, he said. They were gone for an hour and 40 minutes. Sanaa did not ask what happened. Malik came back and went to his room. But before he closed the door, he said, without turning around, he needs to work on his left hand. Sanaa looked at Kyren. Kyren looked at his own left hand. "I know," he said. Sanaa did not forgive him on any particular day. She needed that to be understood by herself, primarily. There was a version of this story where the banquet and the evidence and Kyren's presence in Chicago constituted an ending, a resolution, a point at which the account was settled and what came after was simply living. That was not the version she was living. What she had was more complicated and more honest than that. She had a man showing up. Every day, showing up. For the hospital follow-ups and the school pickup on the days she worked late, and the grocery runs that he was getting better at, had learned the specific brands that Malik would eat without complaint, and the exact type of granola bar Asher liked, had learned these things by paying attention rather than by being told, which mattered more than the information itself. For the Tuesday evening when Asher had a meltdown about a history project that had gone wrong and needed someone to sit with him while he started over, not to do it for him, just to be present in the room while he collected himself, Kyren sat there for 90 minutes without his phone, without leaving, without making it about anything except being there. After Asher went to bed that night, Sanaa stood in the kitchen finishing the dishes, and Kyren stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Then she said, "He used to do that alone." Kyren was quiet. Have a hard time and then go quiet and work through it alone because there was nobody to sit with him. She did not say it as an accusation, just as a fact, delivered to the air between them. He's never had anyone just sit. Kyren said, I know. She handed him a dish to dry. He dried it. That was not a moment of forgiveness. It was not a moment of reconciliation. It was a dish being dried at 10:15 on a Tuesday evening by two people who were trying to build something real in the space left by everything that had been taken from them. It was also, in its own quiet way, everything. Hyejin lost the syndicate in pieces. The attorneys who had been present at the banquet began distancing themselves within 48 hours, the specific, business-like withdrawal of people protecting their own interests, which was not loyalty but functioned like it for Kyren's purposes. The financial transfers were reviewed by two independent forensic firms, both of which reached the same conclusion. The state attorney's office in Illinois and the relevant Korean authorities received documentation simultaneously. Kyren had coordinated the timing deliberately to prevent anything from being buried in a jurisdictional gap. The process was not fast. Legal processes rarely were. But what moved faster than the legal process was the one that mattered more to Kyren, the organizational one. The inner circle of the Valez group, presented with evidence that their authority structure had been built on the exploitation of a man's injury and the attempted murder of his family, recalibrated with the pragmatic efficiency of people who understood that the current arrangement was no longer viable. 3 of them approached Kyren about restructuring. He had one conversation with each of them. Then he did something none of them expected. He walked away from all of it, not in anger, not in disgust. He explained his decision once, clearly, to the people who needed to hear it. He had built something with his absence that was more important than anything he could build with his power. 2 boys, 1 woman, 1 kitchen, 1 court, 3 blocks from the apartment. That was the empire he was interested in. The Valez group would be restructured under new leadership with full legal compliance. That was the condition he attached to his departure. And the condition had teeth because the alternative was him providing everything he had to the authorities without a restructuring framework, and everyone in the room understood what that meant. He walked out of that meeting and called Sanaa. "It's done," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Come have dinner," she said. He came. The dinner was rice and chicken and a salad that Malik had made with the aggressive confidence of someone who believed they were better at this than they were, and was approximately 60% correct. Asher had set the table. Kyren had brought bread the good kind, from the bakery 3 blocks in the other direction from the basketball court that he had found by walking the neighborhood alone on a Saturday morning, learning the geography of a life he was being allowed to enter. They sat. They ate. Malik argued that the salad needed more lime. Asher said it was fine. Malik said Asher's standard for fine was too low. Asher said Malik's standard for everything was too high, and that was why he burned toast. Malik said he had not burned toast in a month. Asher looked at Kyren. Kyren said nothing, which was the correct answer, and the one that made Asher smile for exactly half a second before he returned to his plate. Sanaa watched her family at the table. It was not a healed thing. It was a healing thing, the present tense, the ongoing one, the kind that does not arrive at a destination but keeps moving. There were conversations they had not had yet. There was trust that was being rebuilt in increments too small to measure individually, only visible in accumulation. There were mornings Kyren drove to Lincoln Square, and Sanaa opened the door with the particular expression of someone who is still deciding, every single time, what this is and what it is allowed to become. And he came anyway. Every time. That was the thing she had not expected. Not the grand gesture. Not the evidence or the banquet or the flight from Seoul. All of that mattered. But what mattered more was the Wednesday eggs and the Tuesday homework and the basketball court 3 blocks away, and showing up on a Thursday when nothing was happening and no crisis required his presence when the only reason to be there was that it was Thursday, and he had decided that Thursday was somewhere he was supposed to be. Consistency is a form of love that does not announce itself. It simply appears, day after day, in the same place, doing the quiet work of being present, until presence becomes something the people around you know they can count on. Kyren had lived the first half of his life building an empire out of fear and strategy, and the particular discipline of someone who had learned too young that care was dangerous. He was learning, now, In a kitchen in Lincoln Square, with burnt eggs and basketball debates, and a boy who sat quietly through hard evenings, and a boy who asked the questions nobody else would ask, and a woman who handed him a dish to dry and did not promise anything except the next morning, he was learning that this was harder than everything he had built before, and that it was worth considerably more. Outside the window of that apartment on a Thursday evening, Chicago moved through its business, the traffic, the cold, the enormous, indifferent machinery of a city that had never slowed down for anyone. The same city where 5 years ago an armored vehicle had exploded on Lakeshore Drive. The same city where 2 boys had been born in the middle of the night into a silence that was not their fault. The same city where a woman had stood in a hospital hallway and made the call she swore she would never make because her son needed to live more than she needed to protect herself. The truth had been buried for 5 years. One phone call pulled it out of the ground. And the people that powerful systems tried to erase, the nurse, the twins, the ordinary life that an empire decided was not significant enough to let exist, were sitting at a dinner table on a Thursday evening arguing about salad dressing. Still here, louder than any lie, more permanent than any empire. If this story moved something in you, if Sanaa's 5 years of silence, Malik's question in that ballroom, or the sound of Kyren burning eggs on a Wednesday morning meant something, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Not everyone who survives a betrayal gets to tell their story, but the ones who do remind the rest of us what strength actually looks like. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Every story on this channel exists because someone survived something they were not supposed to survive and had the courage to let it be known. Your comment below is part of that. Tell us which moment in this story hit you hardest. Was it the phone call, the banquet, or that quiet Tuesday evening when a father just sat there because a boy needed someone to sit? Write it below. And share this story. Because somewhere out there, someone is in year 3 of their silence, and they need to know that one phone call can change everything.